Good morning and happy Friday. So in my hands is a brand new microphone, and I'm not going like this. I'm holding it here. We're getting there. We're getting there. I give all the credit to Killian because he really kind of took ownership of this process, and he got us this very nice microphone, and there's an earpiece that our speaker's going to use, and then we're going to have some guys in this week to work on all the technology here, so we're getting there. You know, it's funny, I've been doing these neighborhood luncheons and I'm talking about the improvements with our expansion, and everyone just kind of listens and nods, and then when I say, and we're going to take care of the sound system in the event center, everyone, yay! So, I guess that's what you really want. All right. I don't have much other than I want to give you an update with the process of the expansion. Part of what we're doing isn't just designing, developing, and having meetings with the town, but we're informing folks such as you through our neighborhood luncheons, but also our neighbors. So last night we had an event and we invited all the neighbors that live on California Road, and 8 of them came, and we had wine and beer, and we did a little mingling, and we had cheese and some fruit and cookies. It was really nice. And then I did a presentation for them to show what it's going to look like. And it was really nice because they were engaged, and the one thing they said, which was striking to me, was how much development there's been in their neighborhood over the past however many years, including putting up housing or developing behind them, talking about the stadium, and they said we were the only ones that went out of their way to invite them in and do something special. So, yes. I'd like to think we won over our neighbors, and maybe they'll go to bat for us when we go back to the town. Our next meeting with the town is next week on the 11th, and we actually submitted all of our designs. And so it's official now. They're gonna look it over. They're probably gonna beat us up a little bit, say they'd like to see this, this, and this, and then we'll come back to them in May with hopes, maybe I'm being naive, but hopes that they can give us approval to move forward in May. So the last meeting was, okay, we like your design, go to step 2. And step 3 then is the one where they sign off and then we're actually in business. So I'll keep you posted. And then the other thing I want to talk about is I'd like to give a star away. So a star for someone who just goes above and beyond, does something extra special. And I'd like to have Chelsea from housekeeping come on. Chelsea's been at Fox Run for some time, and she knows us better than anyone. She knows our culture. I'm going to read the notes from the star, and I'm going to tell you, kind of give my input. But according to Matt and Amanda, Chelsea for months has just been going above and beyond with everything. And specifically what they focused on is training. So as we have new housekeepers coming in, Chelsea's been doing a lot of the training, and the trainees love her, and she's just got a nice special touch, and it's one thing to show someone how to do their job, but how to do it within our culture is a little different. So what I can tell you, just seeing Chelsea in assisted living working is it's not just about tidying up someone's room, it's about making a connection with a resident. So you all know my mom lives over there, she loves Chelsea. But that is nice. But all of our other community members over there, they look forward to her visits, and it's not just, again, it's not tidying up, it's all about making that connection, and they feel like she's part of their family. And that's not something you can teach, it's just who you are as a person. So Chelsea, thank you so much. Here's your star.
Thank you.
Yeah. You don't have any other ones? I'm surprised.
I think there's a purple one under there somewhere.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
So do you want to say anything to everyone?
Just thank you.
Okay.
I don't have much of a voice right now anyway. So.
Thank you so much. We're so lucky to have so many people here just like Chelsea. All right, all of you get back to work now. Thanks for coming. All of our housekeepers are wonderful, and I know you get to meet with all of them when they're coming and working on your apartments, but it's nice to be able to recognize them. And Chelsea might not be a face you see very often because she does spend a lot of time in our health summit. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pass the mic off to Allison.
Well, this is weird.
It's hard to give up the new mic.
I know, it is. I'm so used to this. I just wanted to mention about the eclipse on Monday. I know we're all very excited, so if you plan on being here on campus, we are going to have a viewing party right outside the Commons entrance. We still have plenty of glasses for sale, and we will have some glasses too, but that starts promptly at 3. We will have chairs set up for you. And then after the eclipse, we have a 4 o'clock happy hour, and we will have some fun snacks. Nicole got some moon pies and sun chips, so we look forward to celebrating. I hope you'll be there. I'm excited for it. And then Wendy Bachman has just a quick announcement about the Senior Wishes Sips, Suds, and Sweets event coming up.
Good morning, everybody. So you've probably by now seen the baskets that are out there, okay? I'm Wendy Bachman. I'm the Executive Director of the United Church Home Society, which is the founder, of course, of Fox Run. And I run a program called Senior Wishes. And every year, Fox Run is kind enough to open their doors and share your home. You are all kind enough to share your homes with a large fundraiser that I have. It's April 18th from 6 to 9 p.m. and we take over the event center, the bistro, and all of the commons area, the pool table area for about 400 guests that come. So Mary Lou really loves this event because we get a lot of people from outside coming to see Fox Run and how beautiful it is. So I just wanted to give everybody a heads up reminder that the event is coming April 18th. The baskets will be out through April 18th. The drawing will be, for all the winners, will be that evening, and then the next day we'll call anybody who won. So you don't need to be present to win a basket. Tickets are on sale at the front desk. They're $60. It is a ticketed event, so if you're planning on coming, you do have to have a ticket. You can invite family members if you'd like. The only thing I would say is that it is sold out in recent years. And so we did have to turn some people away last year, and we don't want to do that, especially residents. So if you are interested in coming, please get your tickets early. Don't wait until the week of the event, because we don't know when it will hit the sellout mark. Let's see, for your $60, you get a glass, and it's called Sips, Suds, and Sweets. It's a wine, beer, dessert, and food sampling. So you walk around, we have vendors set up everywhere, and you sample what they have. We have a lot of great vendors this year, a lot of new ones actually. We have Pelicano Vineyard, which is the new winery in Hamburg, is going to be here. The Ginger Snap Patisserie, which is right here in Orchard Park, and Cork and Vine, they're both going to be here. The Ridge in West Seneca is going to be here, Frankie Primo's. So we have a lot of new vendors this year. There's live music, and you just walk around and you do your sampling, and there's the basket raffle, there's a couple of other raffles that we have. We have a large silent auction that's set up in here. We have some of our wish recipients come that night, and so we introduce them to the group. And this is the largest fundraiser for Senior Wishes. And what Senior Wishes does is we grant wishes to lower income seniors in a 5-county area of Western New York. And individuals living in care facilities. We also have a very large veterans program that's not income qualified, where we recognize our senior veterans every year with hero boxes. Last year we did over 100, we did like 106, I think. 12 were World War II veterans, 3 actually were residents of Fox Run. We do a huge Christmas program where we adopt an entire nursing home and everyone gets new pajamas, stuffed animals, blankets, puzzle books. And then in addition, we do about another 100 or so gifts to people in the community. So our program has really expanded, and this fundraiser is our major fundraiser for Senior Wishes. So does anybody have any questions? Bill?
How many vendors are you going to have?
Usually, I think there'll be 24 this year.
Excellent.
24.
It's a great event. It's a lot of fun. It really is.
Great event, great cause. Any questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. And like Bill said, it really is a wonderful event. event, and Wendy and her team do a marvelous job. And I would like to bring up Sue Oliver to introduce our speaker today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce the speaker. I had some notes because guess what? I'm old and I forget things. Okay. Robert Goller is here, and he is a former editor of the East Aurora Advertiser. He is the historian for the town of East Aurora, and I know you have all heard about the Roycrofters, and he knows about everything there is to know about the Roycrofters, and he's going to share that information with us today. He graduated from Geneseo with very high honors, and he's very well thought of, and I'm just happy to introduce Rob.
Okay, I'll take that one.
Fast forward or?
Okay, we'll figure it out. Wonderful. Okay.
Turn that on.
Can you hear? There we go. Can you hear me? Wow, I heard I'm the first person to use this. Just a second, so this is fantastic. All right, I'm going to get in position over here. So I have wonderful. Well, thank you so very much for inviting me to come today. I just realized on the way over, and if you haven't looked out the window today, please don't. Wait till next week where it's supposed to be in the 60s. But it's a beautiful drive over. But I was thinking, I've been here before, but I have not been here since COVID. So this is a big day for me. I enjoy seeing all these familiar faces from East Aurora and all the other folks who introduced themselves this morning. So thank you so much for inviting me to come today. I am the town and village historian, and I heard you're going to be watching the eclipse, like everybody else, I hope, on Monday. If I can just give a little plug. I've done a ton of research into eclipses in our East Aurora Orchard Park area, because I've been doing it since 2017 as we've been ramping up for this one. And I've called it a once in a more than a lifetime experience. It's bigger than once in a lifetime. The last one we were in the zone of totality was 1925, January of 1925. There was a ton of hype. The weather forecast was fantastic. We were supposed to have sunny skies, and then that morning some clouds went over. And most of the local newspapers the next week just put a little paragraph saying, yep, it happened, no big deal, big disappointment. So we don't really know what happened. We know people went outside to watch because even with clouds, it's still a spectacular event. We found a family in East Aurora dug through journals because I said, how wonderful would it be to have a journal of somebody who experienced the eclipse in East Aurora, and they found their grandmother's entry that day. So, please, if you have not started a journal, please do. Honestly, your great-grandchildren are going to care what you're thinking about the eclipse, the upcoming presidential election. Either way, they want to know what you're thinking, and the newspapers aren't covering the stuff anymore, so it's even more important, the day-to-day life things. Please, if you haven't started, keep a journal, give it to someone you can trust to keep it for eternity, your town historian, because it's really important. You are part. History is just as much the future as it is today, as it is the past, and people, I tell you, in 100 years, the next one is going to be 2144, where we're in totality. 2144. None of us are going to be around, right? I hope I can live forever, maybe someday, someday they don't want to. But it's really important, and they are going to look back in 2144. The Orchard Park East Aurora historians are going to look back and look for documentation about the previous eclipse, I can tell you. So, journal what happens on Monday, and then keep doing it. Your day-to-day life is important. People will look back on it and want to know about it. So today, I want to talk about the Roycrofters. I was asked to talk about the Roycrofters. We often hear about Elbert Hubbard, right? How many of you know Elbert Hubbard? And how many of you have been to the Roycroft, right? How many of you know Alice Hubbard, his famous wife, who was a suffrage leader? Yes. I'm not talking about them today. Albert Hubbard had an ego and doesn't need me to talk about him. He was famous enough. I'm going to talk about the folks who made the Roycroft run. The day-to-day folks that you might be surprised to learn about. How many of you are familiar with the game Where's Waldo? You've probably seen those cartoons, right? Where you have to find the character Waldo in this vast picture of cartoon characters. Well, I changed the game to Where's the Roycrofter? Can you find the Roycrofter in this picture? Well, no. Presumably top left, right? That's a gentleman named Stacy, and he was the assistant coach of the high school track team. This is a picture of the high school track team at East Aurora High School, and yeah, he sticks out like a sore thumb because he's wearing the Windsor tie that was trademarked by Albert Hubbard. And we have this idea in our head that all the Roycrofters ran around wearing these Windsor ties. It was actually a marketing campaign. You could actually send money into Albert Hubbard and he would send you a Windsor tie so you could be a Roycrofter in California, all across the world. And a lot of Roycrofters did look like this in their formal settings. They would wear the big Windsor tie. But most Roycrofters, see, they look like that in a big tie and walk around town and you look just like a Roycrofter. They were hippies before hippies were popular in the 70s. They had long hair. We look back on it, we don't think of it as a big deal, but back in the turn of the century, it would have been a very big deal to have long hair like that. You would have been a hippie before your time. So this was the look of Roycroft, the official look of Roycroft. But most Roycrofters look like this. Everyday workers, right? This woman, every day, you would not think of her as a Roycroft if you saw her walking down the street. She has her hair pulled back either with a hairnet or a string, plain clothing. She went to work every day. This is the vision of most Roycrofters, but the other vision is what has been sold to us over the years. Now, there's a big difference between Roycrofters between the time of Albert I and Albert II, who was known as Bert. Albert I, you can see the shoestrings tied around his head in order to keep his long hippie hair back. He was eccentric, he was a socialist, he had crazy ideas like, women being able to vote. That was considered a crazy idea back then. He was a suffrage movement. So he caused a lot of problems. And he was very progressive. He also didn't allow drinking. He was a prohibitionist. So that was pretty controversial at the time too. His son, on the other hand, just to give you an idea, I talk about Albert Hubbard in another program, but Albert Hubbard wanted to donate his collection of writings to the village library, and the village rejected it. Saying it was objectionable. And they said they would add it to the library, but they would put it in a special section of objectionable literature. So that's the idea about Albert Hubbard. He had very progressive ideas. His son, on the other hand, who took over when Albert Hubbard and Alice died on Lusitania, he was the mayor of East Aurora. He was Kiwanian of the Year. Albert I would not have been Kiwanian of the Year. So there's a vast difference between the two eras of Roycroft. So when you're studying the Roycroft, 1915 is really a big change. I hear people say a lot, my mother worked at the Roycroft, my grandmother worked at the Roycroft. She probably worked during Albert II, Bert. He hired a lot of people from the community. Albert I had college-age students coming to East Aurora to meet the Messiah of Albert I. He wrote a lot. People came to East Aurora looking for him. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But Bert ran it more like a business and was from East Aurora, more of a businessman. And you can see kind of the difference. Bert is dressed in the Windsor tie, but he was more East Auroran, plain, and he was the mayor of our community. So there was a difference there. Some of their stories. Edward Felix Shea, he's one of my favorites because he was the editor of the Roycroft magazines. And if you want to learn more about him, these photographs are great. I'm going to be showing you a lot of photographs of Roycrofters. Alexis Fournier, you might be familiar with him. He's a famous Roycroft artisan. His son was actually a portrait artist, a portrait photographer. And he took a bunch of pictures of Roycrofters. And that's what we have, so it's fantastic. So these great pictures, the difference between Felix Shea's book image and a portrait of him like sort of every day. So he captured everyday pictures, Alexis Fournier's son. But this is Felix Shea. If you want to know about life on the Roycroft, read his book, Albert Hubbard of East Aurora. This book here, he talks about coming to the Roycroft campus one day. He was one of those people who came to East Aurora to meet the Albert Hubbard, and shows up, talks to a gentleman asking for directions, and it turns out it was Albert Hubbard that he was asking. He thought he was going to be able to live in the Roycroft Inn, and everybody was like, oh, no, everyday workers don't live at the inn, they live at the dormitory a couple blocks away. So if you want to know more about life on the Roycroft campus, this book is great, and Felix Shea wrote it. Now, it's the same story is going to be told over and over again about these folks on the Roycroft campus. They came, some of them didn't have a whole lot of skills. They'd start off doing custodial work or lots of things that needed to happen on the campus, and they would work their way up, and that was the case with Felix Shea. Very few people came to the Roycroft campus and were given a department head position. That's just not how it worked. So they worked their way up, and Felix Shea was one of them, worked his way up to becoming the editor of the magazines. Albert Hubbard didn't write, I know, shocker, but he did not write everything that was in his magazines. He had a staff. This is Frederick Band, Freddie Band, and he was came from England, so again, a lot of immigrants came to the Roycroft campus, and he brought his children, and a friend of him had recommended him for a job at the Roycroft. He had been a butcher in England, so that was his skill, but they didn't need butchers at the Roycroft. Didn't really have any livestock that they needed to have a butcher for. So he started off as a custodian, cleaning, and then he did such a great job that he learned how to do advertising. So as he would work during the day as a janitor, and then at night learn the advertising trade from Albert Hubbard, and then he went on to run the advertising department, worked his way up. This story is quite sad. His son, who was pictured with him, went off and served in World War I. As we all know, November 11th, 1918, the armistice was announced. Everyone was excited, including the Band family, because their son was coming home, and they find out after the fact that he had passed away in the war and given his life in World War I. That was the case with a lot of people because the communication was so bad that they didn't get word for sometimes months after the war had ended that their sons were not coming home. And so that was the case here. They actually announced his death in the Easter Advertiser the same week as they announced the end of the war. So it just goes to show the timing there. So Freddie Band, one of those great stories about the Roycroft of working his way up. And here's him later in life. In addition to his success at the Roycroft, one of his claims to fame in East Aurora, he started the Kiwanis Senior Citizens Christmas Party that they have every year. This gentleman, John Foster, known as Uncle John or Mr. John, was a woodworker and worked for, he was a horse candler at the Roycroft. They had stables at the Roycroft, and he was one of the characters of the Roycroft. Imagine living in East Aurora. I mean, this is, and these folks are just wandering around town. Albert Hubbard brought some interesting characters in. This was one of them. This was a portrait session that Alexis Fournier's son did. It appears like he's sleeping. Maybe he did fall asleep during the portrait session. But again, he handled the horses and odd jobs around the Roycroft. When we talk about Roycroft, we think about the art, right? Furniture makers, bookbinders, the writers. There were also a whole bunch of people behind the scenes who did a bunch of work, including John Foster. This is the Alexis Fournier. The story goes that Albert Hubbard met him at an art show, and they were talking about the Roycroft campus, and Albert wanted to bring famous people to his campus, and said, as they were parting ways, Albert Hubbard said, June 1st at sunrise, meet me in East Aurora. And apparently, Alexis Fournier kept the appointment. And he converted a old stable on Walnut Street into his studio. It's still there. Alexis is one, and then he went off, he actually went to France to study with the Barbizon School. and became a really famous artist because he traveled around. One of the things that makes him really unique is he ended his career in East Aurora, even after the Roycroft closed. So most artists got sick of Albert Hubbard after a while, and his ego, and the egos would, clash, and they would move away. And Alexis Fournier stayed. And there's a lot of paintings of Alexis Fournier in East Aurora. If you go to the East Aurora Library, they have a collection there, including his self-portrait. Again, an eccentric character. Look at his pose. He died, actually, I wrote about him last year on the 75th anniversary of his passing. He painted in the morning one morning at his studio on Walnut, and every day he'd walk to the mailbox to deliver his mail. Before email, right? And the internet, he'd have to actually mail letters, and he fell on ice and hit his head, and he passed away from the injuries of that. He died in East Aurora. He ended his career in East Aurora. W.W. Denslow, you may recognize the seahorse in the corner there. He designed the look of Roycroft. So the seahorse, you'll see on a lot of things. He was an illustrator, so he illustrated a lot of the early Roycroft books and magazines. So you'll still see the Roycroft symbol you see today, the seahorse, a lot of the things that you see around the Roycroft campus, the imagery is because of W.W. Denslow. His claim to fame, though, well, apparently he had a foghorn voice and he was really loud and he annoyed a lot of people. But he had a walrus mustache, they described it as. A very eccentric man, smoked the pipe, walking around town. But his claim to fame is after Roycroft, he went and with L. Frank Baum collaborated on the Wizard of Oz books. So all the imagery you see in the Wizard of Oz is because of W.W. Denslow. So even the imagery, the images of the Tin Man and the Cowardly Lion, all those images were created by him. And still today, so when you go see Wicked at Shea's, all that imagery is originated with him. And it just went through the process from book to movie to musical. So he's the reason, and he lived in East Aurora. He had a sad ending. Unfortunately, he had struggles to sell his work after The Wizard of Oz. He blew all his money by buying an island out in the Caribbean and naming it Denslow Island and proclaiming himself King Denslow I. Eccentric, yes. So he was the king of his own island, but didn't have any heirs, so there was no Denslow II. But he blew all his money on this island and other things. He had struggled with alcohol, and he finally, after years of not getting any work, landed a job at Life magazine. They hired him to do illustrations for Life magazine, and he got so excited he went out on a drinking binge and passed away. So that's how he passed away. But a brilliant artist, very eccentric, the kind of person Albert Hubbard loved to have on his campus. Charles Youngers was a bookbinder. He lived in town. Again, posing. These are posed pictures, remember, so they wouldn't have been probably wearing these outfits every day. This is him later in life. Yet again, he stayed. Many people who might still be around might remember him. He lived on Prospect Avenue. Emil Saline, also another, he worked in the print shop, another immigrant, came to East Aurora to work at the Roycroft campus and stayed through. These are three of my favorite people. How many of you might remember Seaman Hood and Maury store in East Aurora, if you lived in East Aurora? Remember Seaman Hood and Maury? It was a department store on Main Street, and it was started by three women. They actually bought the old Variety store. The store burned down, and they rebuilt 2 years after buying it, and named it Seaman Hood and Maury. And the three women, Aileen Seaman, Beulah Hood, and Betty Maury, started at the Roycroft. And they learned all the business acumen and everything from Albert Hubbard. This is Aileen Seaman with Alice and Albert Hubbard and a guest. And he encouraged it. I always wondered how three women could start a business because the banks would not give you a loan. Banks wouldn't allow women to open their own accounts until the 1970s. Blows my mind, but it's true. Albert Hubbard had a bank and loaned them the money along with some other people. And they became really well known for their department store. They were actually in international magazines on how to put together a successful department store. and it was these three women, Seaman, Hood, and Morey. Carl Ahrens was one of the famous artists. The woman standing next to him is Eleanor Douglas Lane. If you're shopping at Tops, that little road there, she had her studio on that little road. She was an artist as well. They were cousins, so they both started out at Roycroft. She went on to become a famous artist as well. I had found a photo that I thought was her, but it was a big frilly dress, and someone at my Bum Fine Arts like, that's not Eleanor Douglas. She was a tomboy from the beginning. You have pictures of her as a child, and her nature photographs were well sought after. This is Paul Bartlett. He never worked on the Roycroft campus, but you might know his work. He has the Michelangelo statue that's outside the middle school today. And Albert Hubbard commissioned this statue of Michelangelo after seeing it at the Library of Congress, and he wanted his own. So he said, I want one of those. And so he called the artist and said, can I have one? Paul Bartlett said, sure. Paid him a lot of money for it. It was taking too long. So Albert Hubbard wrote to him and says, what's taking so long with this statue? And Paul Bartlett sent him back a turtle and said, good art takes time. Stop bugging me. And the turtle ended up placed under the statue. And then it was stolen, and then they put a new one there. But again, another eccentric artist on the campus. Ali Baba, but his real name was Anson Blackman. He was the handyman at the Roycroft campus. So he took care of everything that needed to be taken care of. Some great photographs, him and his wife, but he got the nickname Ali Baba. Albert Hubbard wrote about him in his magazines using that nickname, a pseudonym, and then everybody wanted to come to East Aurora and find Ali Baba. And this poor guy couldn't get any work done because everybody was coming to see him on the campus. So, him with the children. So he was one of the characters too, and he was made famous. We have to remember that Albert Hubbard's writings were, Message to Garcia, which he wrote, was second in printing to the Bible. So he had a huge following, so all these folks would come to East Aurora. Walter Jennings was a silversmith. And he's pictured with a bunch of Roycrofters here. And his son, you might know his son better than him, is Rix Jennings, who was, we call him the Norman Rockwell of East Aurora. He painted all sorts of local scenes. He was in charge of any logo you see, the Aurora Arsenal, the village logo, the town logo, the Main Street banners at Christmas time were all his designs. He grew up on the Roycroft campus, which is very unique. There weren't a lot of children on the Roycroft campus, and he was one of them. And he was inspired by the art. And he lived through the 90s. He actually worked for Disney. His animation was included with, he worked on the animation team of Fantasia, the movie Fantasia. And he lived in East Aurora. It was amazing. He went out to California for a while. His artwork is still around. You might be familiar with this. He was commissioned for calendars. He was commissioned for all sorts of things. So all these village scenes that you may be familiar with are Rix Jennings. And if I can brag for a little bit, there was an auction of his work a few years ago. I had been trying, among other things, I am the master of ceremonies of the Christmas Carolcade in East Aurora, and I've always wanted the Carolcade painting that he did back in the 80s. And I went to the owner, and they wanted way too much money for it. And then it came up for auction, so we now have two pieces, and I'm a huge fan of Rix Jennings, and so I'm hoping to get more work of his, but Hamlin Park as well. And we love, it's our favorite Christmas decoration at home. But his work was inspired by Roycroft. Again, if you lived in East Aurora in the 1970s, he designed the Christmas sign, or the banners, they're actually wooden, that were on Main Street. At Christmas time, I came across, I'm the owner of this one now, and we put it at Christmas. So he was inspired by Roycroft. So Roycrofters are still here today, and their work is still with us. What's a Roycrofter and what did they do? There were approximately 50 in 1898 on the payroll, 175 in 1900, 300 in 1901, and then Albert Hubbard became famous. And he had approximately 500 in 1915. He was the biggest employer. And he made sure the village board knew that. Blacksmiths, they had horses, they were running a business. So there was blacksmiths working on the campus, printers. This is the print shop. They would use the old-fashioned presses to print all the magazines. Bookbinders. Women mostly would be in the bookbinding department, hand sewing the binding on the books. So again, if you have a pre-1915 book, it might be worth something. After 1915, Albert II took his dad's writings, because Albert II knew he wasn't a writer or a philosopher, and he sold his dad's writing. He kept reprinting it, and they sold thousands and thousands and thousands of copies of books. So after 1915, they're not as valuable. But the leather-bound books, the art of binding books, and he would hire local people and they would bind books and illustrate books. There were illustrators. And if you walk into the Roycroft buildings today, these are still there. I'm fascinated by this picture. Look at all that. Those are pages that ended up in books. Stacks and stacks. And all these people, this is 1923, this is when Albert II was selling his dad's writings, and they were producing tons of books. Look at all that. Stacks and stacks. And we forget that a lot of you have Roycroft furniture, you may have Roycroft leather, things like that. He hired other disciplines, but he started off in writing in magazines and books. That's his fame. So this is the beginning of Roycroft. These are the illustrators. They would actually do china, and they would hand paint Roycroft china. Proofreaders. You had to proofread the magazines, so Roycrofters included those folks. This is Miss Lipset. She worked in the, she was one of the people that her dad owned a livery in town, and she worked at the Roycroft. She was the head of the subscription department. Someone had to keep track of all the people who were buying subscriptions. So she was a Roycrofter. The shipping and packing department, you might recognize that woman who I showed you earlier. None of these people wearing Windsor ties. You wouldn't think they look like Roycrofters, but they're Roycrofters. This is the mail room. They would prepare the mail. Again, Albert Hubbard's magazines. He was the Jeff Bezos, the Facebook of his day. He was really, really famous, and he did it all from East Aurora. And every day there'd be bags and bags and bags of mail. The mailing department, so keeping track of all the subscriptions. And this was just one delivery to the local post office. And remember, someone had to pack all the bags, prepare the mail. That's what was happening at the Roycroft. So when I said to you earlier, I wanted to chat about people who might not get recognition as Roycrofters. These were people. The gentleman driving the Roycroft mail truck, he was hired. He was working there. It was his job. There was a bank. This was Albert Hubbard's private bank. And when I say bank, he would take your money and you would be investing in the Roycroft, and then you would get a dividend. So he had bankers. Love this photo. The bankers, look at the young people with the head of the bank, and they're in front of the vault. The vault is still there. And so all these people were employees. All these people were Roycrofters. They weren't artists, but they were part of the Roycroft. And I love that old phone sitting on the table there. Yeah. The powerhouse employees. At one point, Albert Hubbard had to have the village of East Aurora said, "You are sucking up way too much of our electricity with what you're doing over there." And so he built his own powerhouse on the campus. That building's not there anymore, but he would need employees to run the powerhouse. Again, they're not artists, but they were part of the success of Roycroft. And again, they're not wearing the Windsor ties. If you would have seen this picture out of context, you might not know it was Roycroft. This was the accounting department. Cecilia Quirk, she was, again, one of those great photographs I was telling you about before, where they would just do portraits of the Roycrofters. I don't like to judge a book by its cover, but I would trust her with my money. She looks like she knows what she's doing. And she was worked in the accounting department. Again, she wasn't part of the hoopla of artists and things, but she was part of the Roycroft. Again, another great view of the Roycroft workers. A lot of them were young. Albert Hubbard did a great job of posing for photographs. He would bring a photographer in, and unfortunately we don't have names of a lot of these people, but you get to see who worked there. There's a better view of that. Another picture of Roycroft workers, overalls. They're not wearing the Windsor ties. Some of their names on the back, Buffum was a big name in East Aurora. Another wonderful view of Roycrofters posing. Roycroft also had a school of life for boys. You would send your boys to a boarding school at the Roycroft. So he had employees that would help with that. Here are some of the boys. They would work on the Roycroft farm. The Roycroft had a farm up on the hill to feed everybody who was staying at the inn. So he had people working at the farm, and actually Roycrofters would go up to the farm to get fresh air. So that was part of Roycroft as well. Great images of Roycroft. You see up at the far right is Alexis Fournier standing next to Albert Hubbard. The Roycroft had a band. They had a German band, because there were a lot of German immigrants, and you notice at the bottom it says, "We are neutral." That was during World War I. To say you were a German band, people wouldn't, honestly, they would not come listen to you. Even though you were German-American, American citizens, they would not come listen to your band because you were German during World War I. So they had to put that little caveat at the bottom. Another picture of the cornet band. There were a lot of cornet bands around at the time. Roycroft had its own. We had our own the Roycroft baseball team. Again, these are two players on the Roycroft baseball team. They're not famous, they're not your Alice Hubbards, or they're not your Alexis Fourniers, they're just regular people in town. This is a Halloween party, so the Roycrofters did have fun. I am aware that there are men in drag in this picture, and I am aware there's blackface. But that was the time period. I use this picture to show people the context of the time period. But this is Roycrofters at a Halloween party. Picnics. Sometimes we get this idea that the Roycrofters was just sitting there making books all day. No, it was a life, and they would go on picnics. The first annual Roycroft picnic in 1916, Bert Hubbard did a good job, Albert Hubbard's son, of making it a business and thinking about, work-life balance that we talk about today so much. So he started picnics. You can see the potato sack races, the food line, some of the Roycrofters at the picnic. Now, after Roycroft, during the Great Depression, Roycroft, people weren't buying fancy furniture anymore. They just couldn't afford it, and the Roycroft and fancy books. So the Roycroft went out of business in 1938, and Bert Hubbard tried very hard to keep it going, but he couldn't. A couple decades later, there's a group called the Roycroft Renaissance, and I consider these people Roycrofters just as much as the original Roycrofters. And Bert Hubbard, who's this great photograph of him looking up at the statue of his dad outside the middle school, started this effort in the 1960s. Grant Hamilton is the publisher of East Aurora Advertiser today. His dad, Charles Hamilton, was part of this group that wanted to keep the history of the Roycroft alive. And the time period was the 60s and 70s. What was happening? Well, Vietnam War and the hippie movement. And so there was a lot of talk about, going back to nature and body, mind, spirit, all those things that the Roycroft stood for years before. So they were bringing that back. And there were a group of folks, Nancy Hubbard Brady, this is them mailing the application for the National Landmark status. And then Kitty Turgeon, you might all know her story's fabulous. Her husband came home one day. He was among the Turgeon brothers who owned a bunch of restaurants in the Western New York area. came home one day and said, honey, I bought the Roycroft. And she goes, what's the Roycroft? She told me this personally. And then her husband and her divorce, and her sister-in-law divorces her husband, so the church, and they end up with the inn and the Roycroft. And so she became the expert on Roycroft. And I give her tons of credit because she was talking about Roycroft when no one cared. 1960s and 1970s, you could buy a Roycroft chair at a garage sale for $10. People just didn't care, and she kept it alive. And I don't have a slide of him, but Peter Anderson was a young man in East Aurora who actually filled out all the boring paperwork for it to be a national landmark. And so these folks stepped up. And this is them mailing the application to the national government to become a national landmark. They cared. And the only reason I'm here talking to you about Roycroft today is because of them. Because if the Roycroft wasn't a national landmark and they didn't do all this work, it would not be there anymore. It would absolutely have fallen to the wayside. And I wouldn't be here joining you this morning to talk about it. So I talk about these people. These people are just as much Roycrofters as Elbert Hubbard. And then lastly, I often get a question, and I anticipate this question from you. Do you have a list of Roycrofters? Was my grandmother a Roycrofter? Can I look up anybody who worked at the Roycroft? Unfortunately, we don't. They didn't keep very good payroll records. We know they were paid. We know people were paid. It was a business, but we don't really have a detailed list of Roycrofters. But there are a couple things that we can do. There's this great book called Head, Heart, and Hand that in the back has a list, a roster of known Roycrofters. Give me a call if you want to know, or you can pick up the book. There's a great list of folks on that. But even better is the phone book. Back in the 1920s, and even later, they listed everybody in the phone book. Husband, wife, children's names, they don't do that anymore, right? Your exact address, the address of where you worked, and your occupation. So you get a ton of information in the old phone books, which was new to me, because when I was younger, and even today, well, today we don't have phone books. Nobody has landlines anymore. But when I was young, it only was the person who called the phone company and the subscriber's name, usually the man of the house, right? But this included everybody. What's great is that it also included everybody, included occupation, and it would list Roycroft for everybody who worked there. So we know in 1924, everyone who worked at the Roycroft because they were listed in the phone book that way. A tedious task, but a gentleman named Mike Kelly, who used to do these cartoons for the Easter Advertiser, took all the listings of everybody in the addresses in the phone book and mapped them out. So we know where the Roycrofters lived in East Aurora. But this gives you an idea of where, in 1927, where the Roycrofters lived. The Roycroft is located in the center of that map, and you can just see how much of an impact it had where people lived. So the Roycrofters were more than just the people who lived on the campus. All right. Thank you so much. I'm open to questions. It doesn't have to be about Roycroft either.
Does anyone have any questions for Rob?
I just wanted to ask Rob if you remembered Gladys and George Scheidmantel.
Gladys and George Scheidmantel, and I'm remiss for not mentioning their names. So Gladys and George Scheidmantel he worked in the leather department, and actually he was a great story. He worked his way up and became the head of the leather department at the Roycroft. Well, they had a house built in 1910 on Oakwood Avenue. It's a Roycroft craftsman home, and because they were the only ones to live there, it's still a Roycroft craftsman's home. It hasn't been changed a whole lot. Well, when she was about 99 or 100 years old, he had passed away. She donated her house to the Aurora Historical Society. And the Aurora Historical Society had a huge collection of Roycroft items. Now today you can go to the Roycroft campus and see the Roycroft, but back then the Roycroft campus didn't exist as a museum. So people in the village had collected a bunch of things related to Roycroft, but didn't have a place to display it. So she donates the house as is. And she had moved to Aurora Park Nursing Home. And the deal was that the Aurora Historical Society got the house if the society paid her expenses for the rest of her life. Well, she was 99 and 100 years old. She lived till she was 106. So she pulled one over on the Historical Society. No, but when I say as is, literally there was canned goods in the basement, and apparently she loved cats. She had a lot of cats, and there was still a cat living in the house. When they went over, they found a cat still there, literally as is. So we laugh about it, but what's fantastic is you can go in that house and see how Roycrofters lived. They got married on the Roycroft campus. George and the both of them got married as Roycrofters. They met on the Roycroft campus. Their love story is connected to Roycroft. So you can see her wedding dress. They have her wedding dress on display. Her bedroom is exactly the way it was left. It might sound a little weird, but her hairbrush is still on the stand next to the, literally left the house as is. But it's fascinating to see. You see the big buildings of the Roycroft campus, the castle-looking chapel on the corner, and you go to her house, and it's really humbling because it's like, this is how Roycrofters lived. So if you have not been to the Scheidemannel house on Oakwood Avenue, I would invite you to go because you can see how a Roycrofter lived. And then their legacy still lives on because they donated the house.
I can tell you a little Grace and George story. One of my very best friends lived next door to them, Matt Masterson by name.
Yes.
And we used to party a lot. And whenever the party was there, Gladys and George were right there. And they were always so old. I mean, but boy, they were so lively, so full of fire. They were just amazing people.
I've heard about those parties. They're really good. What's very interesting is, so the Scheidemannel house is between Center Street and Walnut Avenue. Right around the corner is the Fournier house. But 2 doors down from the Scheidemannel house is another Roycroft house that was owned by Stephen Hood Morey. Actually, Morey was separate, but I believe Miss Seaman and Miss Beulah Hood they lived together and they ran the business together. So that neighborhood must have been absolutely amazing back in the day. Yes, ma'am.
Who owns the Roycroft now?
Funny you say that, because as of April 1st, Douglas Jamal, the developer from Buffalo, purchased from the Webb Foundation the Roycroft camp, the Roycroft Inn, the chapel, and that everyone's asking, what's Gateway Park? You might have seen it in the paper. They say Gateway Park. It's a little, to say park is exaggeration a little bit, but it's that corner lot that they had put a monument there across from the chapel. So he purchased that, and he has plans for that. The other side of the campus, the print shop, the furniture building, those, Roycroft Campus Corporation, that's a separate entity completely, they own that side. And then the building in the back, the old furniture shop, is still owned by a private entity. So you have a jigsaw puzzle of ownership there. As you can imagine, and I don't think they'd be upset with me telling you, it gets a little dicey, trying to work together with different groups. So they're doing okay, but actually, Doug Jamal, that was in the paper this week, that was finalized this week. So the inn has new owners now.
What's the national monument status? Did he declare it a national monument?
Oh, absolutely. So 1985, you might remember Jack Kemp, who was our congressman in the Buffalo Bill. He was a big deal in getting it named a national landmark. Those people I showed you at the end of the presentation, the Renaissance folks, Peter Anderson, who was a young man who was misunderstood, just as an aside, he would walk around town and stand for hours staring at a building. And people always wondered what he was doing. And then he'd go home and draw or paint that building in detail. Like he had a photographic memory. He did all the survey work and filed the paperwork, Kitty told me that, for the National Register, which is the step before National Landmark. So he deserves credit for that. Again, back when people didn't, Roycroft wasn't the in thing, you know? Now everybody designs their houses as Roycroft. The Plaza Parkdale Elementary School is Roycroft style. Everybody wants, but back in the 60s and 70s, that was not true. So, but it became a National Historic Landmark. Kitty Turgeon told me a great story. She was there when they were naming the names, and she said it was funny because they started off with Alcatraz and ended with Roycroft. So we're the same year. Yes, sir.
You may have said it, I apologize if you did, but where does the name Roycroft come from?
He stole it. He stole the name. He studied with William Morris over in Europe, and the translation is, Roycroft was actually already a name over there, and he took it, but the original translation is King's Craft. And he had the head, heart, and hand, body, mind, spirit. You can say it in a number of different ways, but his idea was that you put your head and your heart into your work, and that everything's interconnected. So he wanted people to, be creative. He was a big oxymoron though, because everybody thinks he was running this utopian community where you could just come and be like, yeah, it was a business. You didn't go there and sit around and sing and sit in circles. He certainly knew life-work balance, but he was a business. So he wasn't a religious cult, like some people say he was, where people would come and worship Elder Hubbard. They would worship him as a business person, and they liked his ideas, many of them stolen. He would just reword Plato, Socrates, he would just reword it. But it worked. He knew how to do that. He knew how to market. He had worked for Larkin. He was an advertising person, so he knew how to do that. But King's Craft is the translation of Roycroft. If you look at the orb, and I don't have an example here of it, the Roycroft logo, and you buy a box of Nabisco cookies, it's the same logo. And they had a lawsuit between Nabisco and Roycroft. And remember, Elbert Hubbard was super famous, so to go up against Nabisco would seem ridiculous, someone from East Aurora, but he could. And in the end, they couldn't really decide who had it first. I have a feeling Nabisco had it first. But they decided that Elbert Hubbard could use it for what he did, and Nabisco could use it for cookies and crackers. And as long as Elbert Hubbard didn't do cookies and crackers, everybody would do that. So that's where the logo comes from and the name. But he was a brilliant advertising executive. Brilliant.
Rob, to some people, you may seem very young to be a village historian. Could you share a bit of your story?
You want to know my age?
No, Rob, I kind of know that.
I'm 48, just to give you context. So I started in East Aurora, and I think this is where you're going. East Aurora has been fantastically supportive of me. In middle school and high school, I couldn't wait to get the heck out of East Aurora. You're young, you want to go places, and I got the heck out of East Aurora. I was on my way to New York City. I was a newspaper editor, so I started my own newspaper when I was 11 years old, Scholars Gazette, and the people of my neighborhood were super supportive, and then it just kept going. And all of a sudden in high school, I had this little business running a newspaper. I was selling advertising. I had a printing contract with the local printer. I was like, how did this happen? And so everyone was supportive of that. This is the days before the internet. I don't know what I would have done if I had the internet when I was in high school. Oh boy, it would have been a lot more fun. Because I physically delivered my little newspaper to every house. Went to college at Geneseo, and then I went on to work in Canandaigua, Rochester, New York. And then I was like, where would be a great place to have a family? And I'm, East Aurora. So I ended up coming, it took a while, but came back to East Aurora. And I worked at the East Aurora Advertiser. And then I got offered a job with the town of Aurora. And Don Dare, my predecessor, announced he was retiring. And when you're the town historian, some towns it's just honorary. They really don't have a job description. In East Aurora it's different. It's actually a job. So he announces his retirement, and the town supervisor comes to me and said, what do I do? Because nobody, we don't have this happen. And he noticed on my resume that I had a double major of journalism and American history. And I always say I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, outside the town supervisor's office. And he offered me the job of town historian. And I say it's the dream job I never knew I wanted. So that's how I ended up from newspapers into historian. It's a part-time job, just so you know, and I do, on the side, I'm writing, I do freelance work. I have a very wonderful spouse who has the health insurance, so I can, yes, I would not be able to do it without health insurance. But I'm writing books, not to advertise, but all the things I've written over the years. A lot of people will ask me questions, and I'll say, I wrote about that 5 years ago. Why don't you remember? Why don't you remember the answer? So I'm compiling everything that I've written, along with some new material, into a series of books. So that's what I'm working on now on the side. So it's just so much fun. And I get to do Carolcade, I get to do a lot of fun stuff. The Millwood Fillmore dinner that Mrs. Wiedemann got to experience for the first time. We do a political fundraiser a fundraiser and I get to make fun of all the local politicians dressed up as Millwood Fillmore. And it's a lot of fun. It gets me into a little bit of trouble. But I get to do a lot of fun stuff. So thank you.
Does everyone give him a round of applause? This
Thank you
was
so much.
wonderful this morning.